So that was the week that was of July 10th, 2020. Keith, this week you suggest that as a major moment in the history of technology in terms of the perhaps potential demise of the Wintel. It used to be called the monopoly. It's no longer the monopoly, certainly the dominance and the replacement by an Apple-centric world. What happened to Wintel this week?
Well, what happened this week is that Jean-Louis Gasset, who used to be a very senior figure at Apple when Steve Jobs was at Next, actually, for the most part, although I think they overlapped as well, wrote he's got this blog called Monday Note, which is very well worth reading. And this week he wrote about the demise of Wintel, taking what Apple announced at its conference 2 weeks ago into account. And what Apple announced is they're going to stop using Intel chips inside Macs. And they already, of course, don't use Intel chips in iPhones and iPads. Many years ago, they took a license out to ARM, which, as you and I both know as Brits, is a British company, but recently bought by SoftBank. And ARM doesn't build chips, just to be clear. ARM builds designs for chips, and those designs then get licensed, and the companies that license them build chips. So Apple builds its own chips using the ARM designs. And the iPad these days is as powerful as most laptops because of that. And they don't just put one ARM chip in there, they put more than one. They put one for graphics, one for security, and one for running the computer. So what Jean-Louis is doing is basically having a funeral parade for Intel. Intel also, by the way, licensed ARM's designs, just in case. And he's predicting that Intel is going to have to abandon its own chips, which, given that they were the foundation of the IBM PC and everything since, is a really, really major event.
But would this come as a surprise to anyone?
I think it depends who anyone is. For industry insiders, no. Intel was really built for the PC era, which means power hungry. Power hungry is the key characteristic of an Intel chip. ARM is built for the mobile era, which is power efficient. And what ARM has done is now combine power efficiency with quality of throughput and computational power. And I think that just means that Intel's natural life cycle has come to an end. Quite a few years ago, I did act for Silicon Valley Bank. A company I worked for went bankrupt, and they had some code to allow Intel code to run on non-Intel chips. And I was given the job of auctioning it, and Intel was the buyer. So I know that Intel can run Intel code on non-Intel chips. So they do have a path to the future. It's just going to be a very different future.
And what does it mean for Microsoft?
Microsoft runs on Intel chips, and there's two impacts on Microsoft. The first is today your Mac can use a technology called Boot Camp to boot Windows on your Mac. That will not be true anymore because the Mac will not have an Intel chip, so it can't run Intel Windows, which means if you want to run Windows, you're going to have to run an emulator of sorts. And it's not clear whether that will even work. So the only real path for Microsoft is to itself port Windows to ARM chips, which it's already done. Qualcomm have a chip called Snapdragon, which is built on an ARM license. And Windows does have a Snapdragon version for some of the lower end Surface PCs, but it's really underpowered and considered to be very buggy. So Microsoft, if it wants to stay in that game, is going to have to go to ARM, at least in part. It will take a number of years, so it's not urgent, but they're going to have to do it.
And what does this mean for Apple?
For Apple, it means much, much higher gross margins. The gross margin, for those who don't follow this stuff, is what's left after you've paid all the costs when you sell something. And right now, a big chunk of the cost goes to Intel. I'm running a Mac Pro here. It has got, is it 12 or 16 cores of Intel chip on it. Apple pays Intel several $1,000s just for that chip. They won't have to pay that anymore. They'll just pay their license fee to ARM, and all they'll have is the cost of manufacturing their own chips, which will be a lot less.
So in other words, more profit for Apple, which they can try to avoid paying tax, right?
Correct. So it's a transformative event. How does it affect venture capital and startups? Not a lot at this point. Venture capital doesn't tend to invest in desktop software anymore. It's all cloud or mobile. So it's really not going to affect startups other than what they buy for their employees.
But Intel really then has become a part of the archaeology now of Silicon Valley. You're suggesting it no longer really is particularly relevant.
It will try to remain relevant. Apple just did a deal with them, for example, for their 5G modem on a chip, which is they plan to put in. The competition is Qualcomm, and Apple chose Intel because they were in a fight with Qualcomm. So Intel does have other products. They're just not industry owners in the same way that the Intel chip is.
What about lists, Keith? You suggest that this week has been a week for lists, lots of different interesting lists, measuring the success and attractiveness of different VC firms and investors.
Yeah, it sounds underwhelming, but it all happened all at once. A really good guy called Samir Kaji published a list called the top micro VCs in the USA. And he made the point that there are 900 micro VCs now in the USA. A micro VC is someone that has a fund that's less than $100 million. Now, back in the day,
900. But what do you have to have? You have to have what, at least 5 million, 10 million?
There's no low number, but there's a high number to make sure micro VC. You are a fund as opposed to an angel, so you've got to be organized as a fund. And last week we talked about solo VCs being individuals with large pockets. This week it's micro VCs. Both of these things point to the structural change in investing. When you and I started in the Valley back in the bubble era, we would typically go to Sand Hill Road and raise a $5 million A round. And there wasn't anyone else. That was your first round. So before that, you bootstrapped. Well, now, and this has been evolving since about 2005 when TechCrunch was founded, Sand Hill Road doesn't do venture investing anymore, or barely. It really does growth investing. And around 2007, 2008, the very first micro VCs emerged. Jeff Clavier, a common friend of ours at Uncorked, was one of the first. Crunch Fund, which is now called Tuesday Capital, which was at the top of Sanjay's list. It came in 2010 or 11. So in a short space of time, from 2008 to 2020, we've gone from 0 to 900 micro VCs. We've also gone to super angels and professional angels, which really didn't exist before 2007 on any scale. And, Kleiner Perkins now invests in growth deals like Twitter when it's worth $5 billion. It doesn't do venture anymore. Some funds like Sequoia do the whole range. And there's a great article in the newsletter this week about the difference between funds that invest throughout the life of a company and those that specialize by either sector or stage. It's a really good piece. So list number one, micro VCs in the US. The day after TechCrunch published its 400 list, called the TechCrunch list, of VCs you can trust or like or feel good about because they're still writing checks, and did a supplementary article, the top 11, I think it was, of those that people like, that have a good reputation. And in reading this, it struck me that there is no quality control on any of these lists. They're just lists. So for the last period since I wrote an essay in 2013 called "This Is Not Silicon Valley," that charted the retreat of venture capital and the move into two pools of capital: seed capital and growth capital. And I started to measure Micro VC's success at that point, and I've now got 10 years worth of data. And so what I did is I took Sanjay's list and I scored his entire list of 900 by their success. And I measured the success using an algorithm. And the algorithm starts with, did they invest in any successful companies? And the second piece is, how early did they invest? And from that, actually, Pat Gallagher at Tuesday Capital, which is now his fund, he started it originally with Mike Harrington when it was called Crunch Fund, comes out number one by that criteria. So they've done very well. And anyway, I scored the entire list, and you can see from the scoring, and it's free for anyone to read on thatwastheweek.com. I now can tell you the top 25 VCs in the microfund category, which if you're a limited partner investing in VC funds is gold. That's the stuff you want to know about. But I can do a lot more than that. The data I've got allows me to score any investor from anywhere in the world down to the city level. And so, for example, I have a leaderboard of angels. In San Francisco, Elad Gil is number one. Fabrice Grinder is number two. And, you can really start to understand success across the entire ecosystem, and you can do it globally.
How did Brad Feld do?
Extremely well. Both Founders Fund and Techstars perform very well. Brad has been in the game a long, long time, and he understands how to play it. He's one of the superpower investors, I would say.
The reason I bring him up, firstly, I just did actually an interview with him. He has a new book out for my podcast show. But you also cite one of his pieces in your reads of the week, in which he gives up on forecasting the future. Is that fair?
Well, if you put it in the negative, I think that's fair. The positive version of the same thing is he believes there's so much going on in the present that we have to fix the present, that the future's always going to be important. But we've reached one of those moments in history, like when the Nazis took power in Germany, for example, a key moment where the present is the only way to have a future. And so Black Lives Matter, the coronavirus, and all of the things impacting the present are what's dominating his thinking. So he says he's giving up on prognostications, at least for the time being. And I do think, and I say this as someone who lives in the future and always thinks about the future, that is an incredibly healthy point of view right now.
I'd be interested in a list also on the politics of the VC, because Brad Feld is unashamedly a progressive. Did you get any sense of that in terms of which of the more successful VCs are more likely to be progressives or conservatives, or is that irrelevant, do you think?
I haven't got that captured in the form of data, so it's very much based on reading people. I think most VCs in the Valley, at least, are on the liberal end of the spectrum, but there are quite a fair number. There's an interview with Keith Raboy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, this week. Who's
to the right of Attila the Hun.
Definitely right wing, but his interview is very good, which proves that politics doesn't prevent you being a good investor.
Yeah, well, sort of a slightly more palatable version of Peter Thiel. As I said, I'd had Brad on my podcast show, and he certainly makes a very good podcast interview. Maybe next week when that runs, Keith, we can talk about the interview. But I know you're also you've also got a piece by Om Malik on, certainly something referred to by Om Malik on the podcast industry itself and its economic viability.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting. I did a tweet this week in response to Hunter Walk, where Hunter Walk said, "Oh my God, newsletters. How many of these am I going to have to read in the future?" And my tweet said, nothing changes. Esther Dyson did newsletters when she did Release 1.0,
Yeah.
and then she did events. And then there was Web 2.0, which was, conferences and website. And then there was TechCrunch, which was blogs and events. Then there were aggregators. Then there was Twitter and Facebook. And now we're back to newsletters.
Yeah.
And I think podcasts and newsletters and video blogs all exist in the same headspace, which is bottoms up publishing. And the business model of bottoms up publishing has always been hotly debated. I personally don't think there needs to be one. I think my business model, when I tweet or blog or do like I'm doing now, is hopefully that somebody thinks I'm good at what I do, and I'll benefit from that either by investing in a company or getting a job or whatever. So I don't look to monetize this stuff. Ohm's point is, thank God for that, because there's so many podcasts now, and they're dominated by the top brands from TV and radio, that it's incredibly hard to monetize a podcast unless you're one of those. And so he's pouring cold water on the business model enthusiasm around podcasts. And Ohm is a savvy, smart commentator, so he's probably right.
And this ties back actually to another point that Brad made in the piece, that change is now, he believes, coming from the bottom up.
Yeah, I mean that by the way is if true is fantastic, because it has not been true for a long time. The Facebook, Google, Apple, etc. Domination of the valley takes the form of promising startups getting bought early through a process called an acqui-hire. And innovation has typically been sucked up. Spotify bought Anchor and has now become the podcast giant. This sucking up sound of all the promising things means that young ideas very rarely transform into big companies. TikTok is one of the exceptions, which also hit the news this week, of course, with all the rumors about it being banned. So bottoms-up innovation leading to big new trends is welcome, I believe.
And of course, ultimately, all this stuff in venture refers back to value. Your final recommended piece today from The Economist focuses on the shift from what they call natural value to human value. What's this shift all about, and why is it significant for your community?
Human value. Well, firstly, I think you've got to be a bit skeptical. The whole valley has been like the rest of the world, by the way. So nothing new here, has been completely woken up by what happened with Black Lives Matter. And everybody has started to reflect on their value systems. Some of them genuinely, others, tactically. First Round Capital this week, Josh Koppelman posted that they're hiring a new associate and welcomed applicants from diverse backgrounds, for example. So, and Josh actually is a really good human being. He's one of the good ones.
You mean there are bad VCs, Keith?
There's bad human beings everywhere, Andrew, as you well know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this move towards human values is of course it's welcome. You question how, you want to really look 2 years from now and see if it still is around.
But the point of the Economist piece was not about human values in a moral sense, but more the way in which human creativity determines economic value. And their argument is that there's going to be a shift away from nature in terms of, digging oil or diamonds out of the soil to the creation of human value. So it's going to be much more of an Apple-centric economy than a Saudi Arabian one. Is
right.
that the point of the Economist piece?
It is. And by the way, for those watching, apologies. My mind was still on the previous question, so I heard the human values, but I didn't hear the economist reference, so I was answering the wrong question. No, that's a great article from The Economist. The Economist has this section called graphic detail, which I draw on twice this week. And what it's really saying is raw materials, physical goods that sit on top of raw materials, and raw materials themselves are going to be responsible for less and less value in the future. I talk to sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East, and every single one of them is trying to invest money for the time when oil is no longer fueling their economies. So it's a real thing. And, Mark Andreessen's Software Will Eat the World, the Economist version of that is human creativity will become more and more important because software is written by human beings. And I think the structure of the world economy, some people call it the fifth industrial revolution or the knowledge economy. There's something in all of that. That said, food and houses and, real things that people need isn't going to go away. So I do think disruption will not only be software. Software will make the use of physical building blocks different, and maybe even robots, which is really software, will be a big part of that. We all expect that to be true. But ultimately, when you need to eat and you need a roof over your head, there's going to be manufacturing and production. And it's going to be a lot bigger for 7 billion people than most software measured by value. So I think The Economist may be victim to its own Silicon Valley think in not understanding the relative size of the digital economy versus the physical economy. Physical economy is way bigger.